One. Hello and welcome to PropTechBuzz, a podcast channel where we talk to PropTech founders and CEOs from all over the world and learn from them insights about running a PropTech business. And I have had some fascinating speakers and founders and CEOs in the past. And today I have an exciting guest to talk about commercial PropTech. However, before I introduce him to you, I would request all the listeners here to hit that subscribe button. If you are a PropTech enthusiast and you are listening to this, then you must subscribe because I have a fascinating lineup of speakers that are going to be coming to this podcast in the coming days, and lots and lots of insightful conversations, lots of cross context between different topics that we have. So it will be super helpful and valuable for you to get to understand these conversations. So thank you for that. With that, let's welcome our guest, Frederik. Frederik Raspe is the co-founder and CEO of Acquirepad. It's an online platform that makes commercial transactions efficient. And Frederik has been a friend of mine since last couple of years. We accidentally bumped onto each other, and we have remained friends because we work in the common industry. And but I wanted Frederik to come on this pod because all my past speakers have been from the residential real estate primarily. So I thought this could be a welcome change. And also for me, I'm very curious to learn from Frederik about the commercial PropTech. With that, let's welcome Frederik. Frederik, welcome to PropTech Buzz. How are you doing today?
Yeah, thanks for having me. Looking forward to the chat. And yeah, as always, I'm also listening to one of the other podcasts in the past, and yeah, happy to be here.
Excellent. So I know you began Acquirepad sometime last year. I just wanted to know what is Acquirepad and where are you placed right now?
Yeah, so Acquirepad is basically a transaction platform for commercial real estate investors. And by that, we mainly mean investors who are commercially investing. So it doesn't really consider the asset classes so much, but it's more about the professional mindset of investors. So it's not about you and I investing into a residential flat, but more about companies investing into real estate.
All right. So I have some questions also later on exactly what kind of, because investors today is very broad, right? So it could be
Yeah,
it
yeah,
could be an individual investor, not just individual. It could be a fractional investor as well. Toward and all the other extreme could be an institutional investor. So
yeah.
have you carved out that niche on exactly what that investor is?
Yeah, so basically we're not really looking at like retail investors if you talk about like fractional ownership, but we're really looking at like semi-institutionals at what we call them. So these are usually banks, institutional funds, specialized funds, and then more broadly, it's going to be investment managers, asset managers, property developers who develop properties on their own behalf. There's different categories of property developers. So there's trading developers, there's development service developers or service developers. And then additionally, we also focus on family offices, whether they're single family or multifamily offices. And
Right.
then additionally, basically the fourth pillar is private real estate companies, or private equity mostly. And that's basically the fourth big group. We're not really focusing on true institutional clients, like the really big guys. That's something we also can cover, and also our solution also works in some cases even better for those. But it's just a different concept in terms of acquiring those customers and sales cycles, which makes it for a young prop tech company, in our case, not so appealing to approach the really big guys basically from the get-go. But if we get the chance to talk to them and we have a good opening, or we have the feeling that we have a good offering for them in the current situation, in the current phase they are in, then we also approach those. Yeah.
Got it. So I will hold on to my questions because I'm really curious to dig deeper. But before that, let's set the context. Okay, so let's set the context of your transition story because I've known you. You've been in products before. So why don't you tell us about a little bit about you, where you come from, and what were your motivations behind starting Acquirepad?
Yeah, okay. So right now we currently launched basically, or we currently incorporated, actually like yesterday, successfully. And where I come from is basically from this professional real estate side. I've been studying real estate. In 2016, I started covering PropTech in a blog basically. So very early on for Germany. In the US, PropTech was always a bit further at. Not sure about the Asia regions, but basically my motivation behind moving into PropTech was kind of like during my studies, during my master's, I had the opportunity to write my master thesis at SAP about machine learning, actually about the potential of machine learning in the real estate sector. And I actually had to do like basically the groundwork because there was not a lot of literature to like look into. And during that time, I got really acquainted with technology. I always was really interested in technology during even my childhood. I'm basically a gamer, so that kind of like prompted me to move further into technology. I kind of decided on a 5-year plan to first have like 2 years in like basically the hard real estate sector, so asset management or investment management, and then 2 years I wanted to work in kind of like a transitory field. So usually that's like transformation management. And then I wanted to move further, maybe with my own company, maybe more into tech, maybe work at a prop tech basically. And it kind of like happened exactly like this, just like fast forward like twice the time. So I started as a broker, worked there for a couple of months, and then moved over to another broker where I worked a bit longer, but I worked as a manager in the digital transformation actually at CBRE. It was a really fun time. I got to learn a lot of great people, a lot of different projects, a lot of different angles. Obviously, CBRE is a super big company and very diversified in what they do and where they're active.
Right.
And then later on, I moved actually into product, as you said, because I was getting really interested and curious about how products are actually being built. Was around that time when I think we met or talked the first time. And also one of the key books that I read at the time was like Inspired, like getting to know more about like the ins and outs basically of what is product management, how do you build products, because already at the time I was looking into the idea of Acquirepad, where I was inspired by an article of the Wall Street Journal basically, where they described the product called Gemini of Goldman Sachs, which kind of got me thinking, if this sector is now starting to build products like this, then this should also be possible in commercial real estate, which then led me down the path to research more about Acquirepad, basically.
Got it. And you were a broker in commercial real estate, or how does a broker in commercial real estate function? Because I have no clue about that one.
So basically in Germany, it's a bit different maybe than other countries. So that's kind of super interesting about real estate in general. Like every country has kind of like the very nuances on the business areas,
Yeah.
depending how international you are. But basically at Cushman, I was a broker. My official title was a junior investment consultant. So basically what we did is we did also the brokerage, but it was more about the consultancy part. So we also worked on the pricing, on the sell side strategy, not only on the pure execution that usually a broker is doing, but also on how are you supposed to sell it, to whom, what's the strategy behind, should you do some extra work. And that was basically what I did at Cushman. And Cushman was focusing at a time on more commercial asset classes, so primarily office, retail, logistics, and similar to every area of investment, there's always like a flavor of the month. So during time, those usually changes. Like retail is not the super sexy asset class. Basically, nowadays it's like healthcare, residential, like the evergreens kind of. And residential wasn't such a big focus at Cushman. It got like later into my time at Cushman, it got more important. But I was more focused on office and retail.
Got it. I would still like to know when you agree or decide to invest your say next couple of years, maybe I do not know, maybe 5 years into an idea, or more, into an idea, you need to do a lot of groundwork. You need to have a belief in the potential of that idea. I just
Yeah.
wanted, I want to understand the potential of the problem. What is the problem that you're trying to solve, and why did you believe it so strongly that you wanted to take a plunge into this?
Yeah, so basically, one of the key aspects that we're trying to improve and solve is how actually transactions are being run.
Mm.
So I believe the way, and that was also my learning during my time at the brokers, was a lot of the work that a broker is doing is quite simple. And it's a lot of like routine works that you have to do over and over. And
Right.
I got to question myself, like, this is not what I studied for, basically. So, and I think the majority of time a investment professional spending on a deal should be allocated more towards the more creative work and
Right.
the work that actually drives value, and not the everyday work, the repetitive work.
Right.
As one of the key things why I think Acquirepad makes sense, basically driving the investment industry into a future where you can use more data-driven or data-supported workflows, and where the investment professional can actually focus on the work that drives the most value for the company, basically.
Right.
And that's kind of like my drive. And in terms of potential, I think if you look at real estate, a lot of focus is obviously always on the transactions. And if you look at the market, it's a huge market on the whole globe. There's real estate transactions going on, especially on the commercial side, which is not visible so much to the untrained eye, basically. Because
Yes.
commercial
Right.
is like super important for everyday work everywhere.
Right.
Because similar to residential, like we all live in a home or like in a house or
Yeah.
building. All the work that we're doing, like somewhere there's a server hosting the server to record this session. We also are both in a building, maybe office building, maybe our residential building, right?
Right.
So everything where there's value creation basically happens in a building.
Right.
And if it's not living, it's usually work, and work makes up a huge part of our life, right? And then also shopping, leisure, everything.
Got
And
it.
I think there's a huge potential. The potential that we're looking at is basically the transaction volume that we have globally. So in Europe alone, that's like 350 billion of euros that were transacted,
Right.
2019, I think. Obviously, you have to look at the trends. But if you look globally, the number is in the trillion. So it's like a huge, huge, huge opportunity that you can tackle.
Got it. So before, I'm very curious to know about the product. How did you conceive the product? How did you validate and stuff like that? Before that, let's understand the status quo of how transactions are happening today, vis-a-vis what Acquirepad is want to achieve the ideal. Okay, so let's compare
Yeah.
and contrast. So what's the pain point? How are the transactions happening today?
So basically, if you look at the transaction today, you usually, let's look at one version of it. You usually have two parties, so a buyer and a seller, right? Similar to every transaction. And then most of the time, one of the sides has a broker in place. So it could be the buyer who's looking actively at properties. So they have a broker who is actively looking for them and sourcing deals. Additionally to the investor themselves, usually they source also themselves. And the broker is kind of like an add-on. On the sell side, the broker is then often in an exclusivity to sell a property, not all the time, but oftentimes. And the broker is basically taking over the work in terms of identifying targets to talk to offer the property in terms of selling it. And then they usually have a host of services that they provide. So some support in like things like the data room, some support in the whole sorts of marketing products or marketing documents that they create. And then there's like different categories basically of brokers. Some brokers, they just do the connection between a potential buyer and the seller. That's kind of it. And then they slowly fade out. Then there's broker who also are involved in the site visits, in the coordination of site visits. There's like a sort of broker who are more focused on basically being a good communicator or coordinator. And then they sometimes also create additional documents such as a bid overview, for example. So you have multiple bidders in a transaction, and then the broker basically create an overview for that. So it kind of depends, but the core is that the broker kind of like solves as the middleman. And if you look at Acquirepad, we're not really looking to cut out the middleman, but actually what we're looking to do is like enable the investment manager, or the investment managers actually, to become the broker themselves, basically. So one of our core hypotheses is that the investment manager can become the better broker if he gets or she gets the right information and tools, basically. And the way a transaction works on Acquirepad is basically every buyer and every seller kind of log in. A buyer has kind of a very stringent set of criteria for the properties they're looking for, that they're willing to invest, they're willing to buy, right? So some investors, they're solely focusing on office properties.
Right.
Some investors are solely focusing on retail. It goes even deeper. Some investors are solely focusing on retail who have a tenant in the food sector or like in the grocery sector. So they have to have a grocery anchor tenant. And these are looking for specific properties, right? And the usual process starts on the sell side. So the seller has to identify in like certain targets, right? Like who can I talk to? Who could be interested in this property? So, and that's usually the point. If they don't have a super good market knowledge and market overview of the players basically playing in this pool, they usually go to a broker, and then the broker takes over and kind of like suggests potential targets. And that's exactly what's happening on Acquirepad as well. Like we suggest in the place of the broker to the seller which are potential targets based on data and not based on gut feel, because a lot of decisions in real estate are based on gut feel and not really clear data. And we put the whole control of the process of talking to people, who's going to be addressed how, who gets which information. That's all in the hands of the seller. And the seller basically has the ultimate control about how this deal is going to happen and who's going to be approached with which information density. And that's basically how kind of a transaction works on Acquirepad. And then we integrated a lot of the key elements that a proper professional transaction needs, like a data room, a proper teaser, like an information memo, all these key elements that we designed and integrated into a transaction workflow. We also provide for the seller and also for the buyer, basically, in order to have a fairly efficient workflow, much more efficient than how it's currently done. So currently you can take up to six months, 6 months actually, the average. At the moment it might be a bit longer, until you reach the closing of a transaction. And with Acquirepad, you could cut this down to like maybe a month. So it's much more efficient, much cheaper as well. Like a broker costs a lot of money. If you talk about like a 20 million deal, it could be 2% in Germany. And with Acquirepad, it's like 10 times cheaper.
Nice. Are there specific listing websites which lists all the commercial properties at one place? Is that how it is, similar to residential?
No, actually, that's interesting because there's no listing sites for commercial. Actually, you can use the same listing sites for commercial properties.
Got it.
Like technically, it's possible. Like ImmoScout, for example, in Germany, there's some properties, but usually it's the smaller properties. And that's kind of also ties into our positioning. So you have a segment that's like, you call it small cap, mid cap, large cap, and then you have even big cap. But the small cap stuff is everything below 5 million. And that's usually the area of investment opportunities that's not super interesting for professional investors. That's usually the flat in Berlin or the house in Munich, right? It depends on the asset class. Like in residential, it's different. Also in retail, it could be different.
Right.
But usually investors are looking to allocate more than 5 million on an asset.
Right.
And as soon as you move above the threshold of 5 million, you suddenly don't see that many deals on these listing platforms anymore. Listing platforms, another negative is everyone sees that you're selling, and everyone knows if you're selling on these listing pages, you're really desperate, right? So
okay. So most of these transactions happen offline.
yeah, I would say 99% of the transaction in commercial real estate are offline. They're not off market, but they're
Right.
offline. So on the
Offline.
market basically means on a listing platform so everyone can see. And it
Correct.
creates a lot of visibility, but it's more
Correct.
negative than positive. You
Nice.
lose the discretion and so on. Like it's a bit unique in Europe. Europe is different to the US. In the US, listing platforms are more common for commercial as well.
Right.
And in Germany specifically, there's no listing platform that's accepted. So everything is going through human hands, basically through email through telephone.
But
And
tell me
most,
why. Tell me why something gets sold offline and does not need a listing. What is it about commercial properties that does not need listing?
it's not about it doesn't need,
Is
but
it because the volume is less? Is that how it is? The supply is less than the demand is more. Is that how it is?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say that there's more demand than supply, but at the moment there's an oversupply, and like the demand side is holding back because of the current financial structures. But basically, one of the key reasons is like on the commercial side of the transactions, it's usually one of the key points is keeping it discreet. So parties don't want to know, or parties don't want anyone else to know that they're moving like 300 million, right? Like, especially the bigger deals, portfolios, they're very discreet. But even like if you sell a 20 million property in like a smaller city in Germany, if you put it on the listing platform, everyone knows. The neighbors know, the city will know, right? It creates a lot of additional communication need. And another aspect, which is really important, is called burning it. So if you show a property, that's kind of the theory behind it. If you show a property to too many people, the real estate people then assume, okay, there has been so many people approached, there must be something wrong with the property. Otherwise, people would already have bought it, right?
Got it.
So and this kind of like decreases your value of your property. So you don't want to show it to everyone. You just want to show it to the people who are actually willing to pull through, right?
And how do
Ideally,
you show it without a listing? Is it they have a broker network, and that's how
exactly. That's what they maintain today is they try to maintain their own personal network. And on top of that, they try to maintain a large broker network. That's what a lot of people call proprietary market access. It's actually similar to venture capital, to be honest.
Got it.
And so everyone is talking to the same brokers, and everyone is trying to get into the favor of the broker. So the broker moves the best deals to this corner, right? And that's kind of like the power of a broker in today's time is they kind of have in certain segments, they have kind of like a market maker mentality. So they can decide who gets which broker. And that's kind of ties in a whole sort of complicated nets of connections, friendships, information moving where, and so on. So it's not super easy. I think in order to really understand it, you kind of have to live in the industry and like understand how these people work and like how the clock ticks. But in essence, those are some of the most important points. Yeah.
Excellent. Some aha moments for me. Now let's move to the product side. So you identified a gap. You identified a gap that needs to be filled.
Yeah.
And then how did you go about building the product?
So building the product and designing the product was obviously a challenge. I think it's always a challenge. But for me, a lot of the work that I did early on was more towards research. So I tried to talk to everyone who tried something similar in the past. And luckily, I've been in the PropTech segment for quite some time, so I knew most of the people indirect, so I could reach out fairly easy. So I talked to the people who already worked on the concepts and on the ideas in the past. Some of them were even successful, but they kind of did certain mistakes where they couldn't grow enough to kind of establish. And then I talked to a bunch of people on my customer side and even on my competitor side. So I talked to basically the brokers, trying to understand, how do you think about the transaction process? Like, what could be better from a broker perspective? But the majority of time I spent talking to users or potential users, basically. So about 100, I think before we started coding, I talked to about 150, had 150 interviews about the product and the processes. It's not always with different people. I would say it's like 70 people, and then 150 calls. So with some people I had like 2 or 3 calls. And I really dig deep. And then initially what we did, we built like a super easy, can't even call it MVP, it's like a functional prototype maybe.
Right.
And it only did like maybe 10% of what the MVP is now doing today, right? Like I would still call it like kind of MVP version 1 maybe.
Right.
And after that, we then looked onto like, how can we fix financing? And during this time, I got the hang of Figma, and then we kind of tried to design as much as possible in the Figma. And then within like a month, we basically had our product, more or less what we're building today was already done like fairly quickly. And it wasn't like super fancy, but it did what it had to do. And then we created, out of the design, we created a click dummy. And then with the click dummy, we did like a couple of tests with the functional prototype. We also did like 10 calls with like prospects, new and old. And kind of, we had a very, a big cooperation with our users and potential customers to really take them into the development and really develop something with them, because in the end, we wanted to develop something that people would like to use and people want, because this in the end is one of the key factors that guarantees that people are using your product, right? And then only if people are using your product, they can actually create value. And if you create value for them, they eventually will also pay for it, right? And that's kind of how we went on. And yeah.
Got it. And did you have your in-house developers, or do you have coders as your maybe co-founder or somebody?
Yeah, so basically we're fairly lean, and that's actually one of our key company culture values, if you want, like lean. And so the functional prototype we did with a no-code platform with our CTO, Manu. And we came to a point where we said, okay, if we want to build the product better, different, right, then we have to incorporate a lot of code anyway. So let's just like cut out the no code. Let's design what we want to do. That's what I did. I'm not a trained designer, but I did like a couple of courses during the time on Coursera about like Google design and everything. And I kind of got a hang of it. I mean, there's so many resources online nowadays. You can read tons of UX, UI stuff. And in-house, I also have a hang on design, maybe because my mom is an architect. But basically, our CTO is building the entire product now. So, and then we have the help of like 2 freelancers who are supporting us on the front-end development. But we're not really, in terms of the founding team, we're not really big fans of outsourcing the development of an MVP to an agency, because I think you lose a lot of control about the product itself. And I think you really have to have kind of like early on, you should have a lot of struggle building the product, because the struggle like helps you learn things the hard way. I mean, it shouldn't be a lot of mistakes, but you should educate yourself about like, how should we build this product? Because in the end, it kind of depends on your area, but I think having a weak product is never a benefit. But sometimes having a good product is not really a benefit, right? Like sometimes the best product doesn't win.
Interesting.
Yeah, like a lot of things tie into product. Like product is not only engineering and design, but it's also like positioning, distribution, feedback loops, etc. Right?
Got
And
it.
yeah, it's an evolving thing.
Excellent. Nice. You mentioned about very important things there. I forgot to ask you. So you all, since you're calling yourself a co-founder, I'm sure you have a founding team. How many of you are founders here?
Yeah, so we're three founders. Originally, I started with Victor, a friend of mine.
Right.
Actually, we met also through LinkedIn and through PropTech. He wrote the first PropTech report for Germany, or well, not for Germany, but for CBRE. And yeah, we became friends like a couple of years ago.
Right.
And then we
So
started.
I would like to know how did you find the founding team? Okay.
Yeah,
So
exactly. So Victor, he's a friend, and so we just had like ongoing chats and so. And I was like, yeah, are you in or not, basically? And he's been talking about this idea or concept of like improving transactions for a couple of years. He has a lot of like papers as well, or not really
nice.
papers, but like articles that he published on different magazines. And then Manuel, which is our CTO, we actually met through YC. So YC has a program called Founder Match. And there I talked to like a couple of people because Victor and I agreed. Victor has also a bachelor in computer science, but he's not really the CTO guy. He's more like the half business, half tech guy.
Right.
And we agreed that we definitely need a CTO, because without a CTO, you can't build a technology company, right?
Nice.
And that's when we decided, okay, let's try to find a CTO, which is already fairly hard, to be honest. Like finding someone who has good skills, willingness to give up a lot of quality of life, basically, and then jump into like a super unsecure opportunity. And that's where we met. Like I met Manuel. We had a couple of chats. We built.
So you met Manuel where in the? Explain to me the founder match program of YC.
So YC is basically Tinder for founders. So you can you're both single basically, but you basically say you either have an idea and you're open to change it. You have an idea, you're unwilling to change it, or you don't have anything basically, but you're open for everything. And you can like, everyone has like a bio, what they did, work experience, previous startup experience, whatever, what's their skills, are they working in engineering, business, or design, or product. And then people can like basically build their profile. And then you can just look through the profiles and it looks interesting, let's have a catch up. And with Manuel, I talked to like 15 people. And Manuel was one of the few people where I said initially, okay, this guy is how do you say, charismatic, enthusiastic, and everything. So and then we had a couple of more chats. I introduced him to Victor, and then Manuel and I worked a bit together. It's also a concept of YC. At least I got to know about it at YC. Is called a build sprint. So basically, you have a sprint of a week or 2 weeks where you try to build something to experience how are you working together, basically, to really understand, do you have a fit, do you don't. And a lot of aspects I would always put on the interpersonal fit, because I think the human fit is much more important than the skill fit, especially early on. You can't have all the skills to start a technology company, like basically impossible. Like if you would have the skills in your 3-man or 4-man team, you would have like 15 years of experience, everyone. And it's more about like willingness to learn, and that you have like a personal fit, and that you feel that, yeah, this could become a friend, could become a close friend, because in the end you're going to be very close, right? And after all, it was the perfect decision. We really get along like super well. And funny enough, we have a very, very similar set of interests and likings, basically.
Nice. And are they all co-located, or they are geographically dispersed?
Yeah, so we maybe also thinking about it, maybe a caveat for today's time is we obviously started remote. And in COVID, everyone had to stay at home. I was already a bit better, but we started in like 2020, I think, or 2021. No, 2021, I think. Yeah, I think 2021. And but yeah, we are remote located. I'm 50% Berlin, Frankfurt, and then Victor is in Munich, which is in the south of Germany, and Manu is in the north of Germany. And Berlin, for the people who don't know, Berlin and Frankfurt are in East Germany and West Germany, basically. So we're basically covering the entire country, which is super neat, to be honest, because real estate being a very local industry, because obviously buildings can't move. It's good for us because we can meet clients everywhere physically, which is also a big benefit nowadays. It's not a prerequisite anymore, but it definitely helps. Yeah.
Got it. Excellent. So product is taken care of. You found a team for yourself. Primarily, where people most startups struggle is you talked about distribution network. Okay, how do you ensure that you educate the market, because it's real estate is very traditional industry. Okay, people, even if it is inefficient, people find it hard to break out of their old habits.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know what was your how were you educating the market, how were you educating your prospects and clients on the marketing side, and then the sales side.
I think in terms of like one of the benefits that we had already is that even though we didn't have a product, I was trying to sell the product already to people in form of a click dummy. And
Nice.
we designed the click dummy. I wouldn't say it's super well designed. I mean, design is not supposed to like how it looks like. Like you probably know the quotes, like, but how it works. And the design dummy behaves fairly well. So people already thought like, is this the real product? Like, can we use it? I was like, no, it's not, not the real product. And so this funnel already of like 70, 80 people that helped us to move into the sell side and later on, basically. And additionally to that, I tried to basically connect with everyone on LinkedIn who had the title investment manager. There's a couple of nuances that benefits us because some industry can't use the same version. But for real estate, obviously, there's a saying, real estate is a people's business. So generally, people are looking to connect with one another, and LinkedIn is kind of the perfect place for it, right? So it's a really good hunting ground for someone like me, basically going on LinkedIn and then trying to add everyone who's like an investment manager real estate. I mean, it's fairly simple to search for. And then you try to get in an exchange. And what we did in terms of educating people, we didn't really educate the people, but we were more looking for, hey, I would like to chat with you. I'm currently working on this and that. Do you have like 20 minutes to chat? I would like to learn your perspective, your experience, blah, blah, blah. And it wasn't really about like educating them, but more like listening to their problems. And then eventually they asked like, what are you doing? And then you kind of like explain Acquirepad and everyone understands, okay, this will solve some of my problems. So basically I didn't have to educate them because they were educating themselves in a way. And I think it's also a different point where B2B is maybe different to B2C products.
Yeah.
In the area that we're in, everyone is basically professional. Everyone understands to a different degree what are the problems, what are possible solutions. And you basically just have to, and people are looking for a solution for the problem that we're trying to solve. So if you present them Acquirepad, they automatically understand, okay, this should work. Let's test it, right? So that's fairly simple.
Got it. Okay. Since you're already touched upon commercial versus residential, maybe you can dig a little deeper on in terms of what makes commercial, because I think one of our conversations earlier, you mentioned commercial in a lot of ways is better in terms of selling than to residential. Am I right?
Yeah, I would say so. In essence, it's kind of a bit complicated because we kind of like misused the term. So in essence, commercial real estate describes kind of like a US-based concept of real estate activities that are taking place not for the need of housing, but in need of making money, basically.
Got it. Okay, got it. Yeah. So
Where I find,
yield is important. Yeah.
yeah, where I find this terminology a bit confusing, if you look at an institutional investor, let's call it JP Morgan, for example, they're investing into housing also for commercial purposes, right? So residential can be commercial, in my opinion, if it's kind of like a certain residential deal. If you buy like a portfolio, if you buy like 300 flats at once, that's also for me a commercialized real estate transaction. And then what we're basically focusing on, kind of derived from the German, is not commercial real estate, but commercial real estate, commercial investors, basically. Investors who are investing into real estate purely on like a commercial based approach, and not on a kind of like what a person might invest for themselves, right? Or for their pension. And that's kind of the difference where I would see where B2C and B2B kind of is. Obviously, in the residential space, you can also build something B2B in residential, because there's so many different moving parts in like real estate. But what we're focusing on is kind of like commercial side, so office, retail, logistics. But actually, Acquirepad also works super well for residential buildings and residential properties and residential investors. But where we make the differentiation is actually who we're actively addressing. So who are we actively reaching out to? Who are we actively talking to? So we're not actively reaching out in majority to the residential real estate companies, but in majority to the companies who own retail location, retail assets, office assets, logistics, healthcare, and so on.
Got it. And but you do not rule out the possibility that in the distant future it could also solve for investors who want to have a portfolio for residential, maybe.
It definitely works for investors who want to have a residential portfolio, like it already does. We actually have a couple of users who are selling and buying primarily residential. But it's not gonna, like, Acquirepad doesn't, I wouldn't say forever, but at least for the next couple of years, we will not incorporate private investors, because private investors have different needs. And it's not really what Acquirepad is built for. Could be maybe in a distant future. Where we make the distinction is not really the asset class, but it's more kind of the user behind it.
Got it. So let's go back to the conversations we were having while you were building with your prospective customers. Okay.
Yeah.
So you showed them click-through dummies, and then they gave you the feedback. Maybe give us. So usually, whenever we start with the hypothesis, and then it completely gets thrown out of the window because we hear completely new perspectives from our customers, right? So what has been your experience with your client feedback, with your interactions with your customers or with your prospects?
So I think for me it's fairly different, because obviously, like, we had also our hypothesis, but since I've worked in the space, I fairly well understood like what's what basically, and what is really the problem, where are the nuances. And some of the things that I kind of like surprised me with when talking to customers were, I read a really good book which is called The Mom Test, and I applied a lot of the learnings that I got by reading the book, basically like asking open-ended questions. So I asked a bunch of open-ended questions. I think in investment communities, a lot of people tend to ask closed questions because they have a bias, and they don't think the bias would hurt. But essentially, I ask a lot of open-ended questions, and sometimes the people were surprised by the questions themselves. Like, sometimes I ask them, like, why do you use brokers? Why do you need brokers? what do you use brokers for? And a lot of times people were like laying back in their chairs and like, it's actually a good question. I never asked myself this question. And this kind of like was super interesting that they kind of like self-enforced their own learning, and they kind of like realized, okay, this is kind of weird. Like, why is it that way? And then people were actually describing, in some cases, actually rare cases, some people were kind of describing what would need to happen in order to improve the transaction itself. And then they kind of were describing what Acquirepad is looking to do, right? So this was super interesting. I would say in some aspects, we also had like a realization of like hypothesis that one of the key things that we are looking into, or one of the key main elements of Acquirepad, is data. And people were saying, yeah, don't go too granular because I think it's already enough, right? And we were just like, yeah, but we're just getting started, right? Like it could be much better, right? So people, I think this is also an area where you can educate people. It's like more data doesn't necessarily mean it gets more complex. I think it's more a question about like, how do you design the product, and also how do you use and how does the user engage with the data, basically.
Right. Got it. And did you not say in one of our conversations when one of your customer is asked you if they could exclusively sell through your product?
True. Yeah. we had a really interesting call with the customer. Actually, I was reaching out. They had like a part of the website where you could where brokers could actively reach out for a corporation. And I just took the opportunity and said, yeah, describe the Acquirepad. Yeah, I would like to have a chat. But yeah, super interesting. Let's have a chat. And then it was a really interesting chat. Went for 1 hour and a half, maybe. So really long. And they were like super interested, and was the perfect timing. Basically, they were getting ready to sell assets, and then currently have assets on our platform. And then towards the end of the conversation, the person asked, is it possible that we can solely sell through Acquirepad and like tell every broker that we're not selling outside of Acquirepad anymore? I was like, sure. Like, why not? You're invited. And this was super interesting. Like, this was a really, really interesting moment, and really showed that there's definitely people who are very thrilled to use something as Acquirepad. Actually, just today I had a similar conversation where someone was like, this is fantastic. I just need to convince my business partner because he's more conservative. So it's always very interesting talking to customers, and I think it's one of the things I actually enjoy most.
A customer who can validate, a customer who is delighted by the solution. For a founder, it's music to your ears, isn't it? It just validates that you're moving in the right direction.
True.
I forgot to ask you about competitors. Are there already existing players who are solving this, or are you one of the first ones?
So I wouldn't say they're competitors who are solving this, because if it's already solved, there's no need. But there's certainly customers who are trying to solve a similar problem. I think where we differentiate with our competitors who are located in Germany, those competitors are usually focusing on a different segment. So that's also where I spent a lot of time early on, was like kind of like doing segmentation and identifying who's going to be our target audience, where does it work actually from a business model perspective. Right. And in Germany, there's a couple of competitors, but they're actually more focusing on the residential market, on the residential asset class, and they're also focusing more on the private investor side. Like, they're kind of mixing private and institutional and everything. They just like put everything into one bucket. Right. And they haven't really, like, what we do is like we prioritize on a niche. Our niche is like professional investors in like semi-institutionals, institutionals. Right. And then across the pond, basically in the US, there's two companies who are doing fairly well. One is called Crexi, and another one is called By Proxy, but they're focusing on a more broker included concept. I think what we are doing is fairly unique in terms of how the platform works, and also our monetization, the whole lot basically.
Got it. And since you are connecting demand and supply, every marketplace has this concept of chicken and egg problem, right? So where should you focus first? There's a concept of equilibrium, okay, because it cannot be demand heavy or supply heavy. So how do you manage this chicken and egg problem for your platform?
Yeah, so this was like a really interesting topic, and I really got to love network effects and the whole stuff. And through my PM background, I basically got also in touch with like Lenny and everything, and Andrew Chen, and reading the book Cold Start Problem. I have it actually in my sleeping room, in my bedroom, and actually was a part of the solution that we actually ended up with was kind of inspired from Lenny, where he did an interview about how different marketplaces like Bootstrap to liquidity, how they solved the chicken egg problem. And one thing that was really interesting was that Zillow used data to like kind of simulate their demand side, and then they approached home sellers or homeowners who are looking to sell their property. Hey, we have the solution, and you can use it basically for free, and so on. And that's something that we did actually. So in Germany is something called acquisition profiles, kind of like a detour. And acquisition profiles are basically like a shopping list for professional investors. So every investor, not every, but I would say 95% of all the investors who are professionally investing into real estate in Germany have it. It's kind of similar to like an investment thesis of a venture capitalist.
Right.
And it kind of details out what they're really looking for, much more granular than what a VC is kind of describing. It would also include like how much revenue does the company have, which area or which geographies they're active in, like all like different details. Some are more detailed, some are high level. And all these acquisition profiles, we had a really long list of potential users. So I think it was like 3,500.
Right.
We went through it, cleaned all the privates out, like all the private investors. We cleaned them out, and then we looked at all the existing investors and looked through them one by one. Actually, was me who looked through every company and said, okay, this is a professional investor, this is not a professional investor, kind of like doing quality control. And then we ended up with 870. Actually, we have roughly 1,000, but not everyone is active on the platform. Roughly 1,000 investors who we then basically reviewed again and downloaded all their acquisition profiles. So it's kind of like a public PDF usually. And then we put this into a database. And then we tested actually this database as a concierge service. So we talked to a couple of users, brokers, and also investors, and said, hey, we have this database that we can use. If you give us your property data, we can input it and generate you a potential list of targets, basically. And that's kind of like how we hacked our demand side, because the demand side was basically present on the platform. And now we're looking to basically source and solve the supply side with this existing data demand side. Actually, by now we have already over 100 companies who are active on Acquirepad. So they kind of have refined the acquisition profiles. And it's kind of one of the key aspects of Acquirepad is the acquisition profiles that are on Acquirepad from the users themselves. They're much more granular than the acquisition profiles that are basically in the PDF. And that's kind of how we ended up solving the key part of the chicken egg problem. I think right now we're kind of on, if you look at the journey, we're now moving into traction, and then we're looking towards liquidity, and then eventually we will come at the point where we are hopefully come to an equilibrium, as you said. But I think that's kind of the masterclass of every marketplace.
Nice. Excellent. Thank you. I'm very, very fascinated about the products, fascinated about all big companies trying to solve technology for real estate investment space. I know that there are big players from the Kasafaris, from the Emos of the world, that they have completely reshifted, refocused, realigned, and they're all building software products to help investors invest on scale, at scale. Um, so, have you also seen this trend? And I just wanted to know, how is technology moving in that direction towards investment management space?
I think it's a difficult question. I think it kind of depends which segment you're in. I think for the cases of Casafari and Immo, I think they're more looking to the residential sector, and
That's correct.
then basically gobbling up only a fraction of the residential market is covered by professional investors. So the
Yes,
majority of the residential market is covered by private homeowners.
that's correct. Only 2.5% of the market is by professionals. So so the
Yeah,
entire market is open for them.
yeah. But to be honest, like a lot of the residential market is actually not really the market because it's inaccessible. Like it's kind of like it's not really like 100% that you're looking at, but probably like a bit less, like 80. So technically they already own more. And in commercial, it's kind of different because in commercial, you also acquire portfolios, but the portfolios, because the single asset is already much more expensive. Like if you look at a office portfolio of like 7 buildings, you're already in the 400 million, right? And then if you're in the 400 million, there's only a very small group of investors who could actually finance 400 million because it's like not an easy task. And so I think investing in scale is not really the thing for commercial real estate because it's not really about like quantity, but it's more about like quality of the assets. Because in the end, the investment horizon is also a bit longer, and you also have to work with very different risks because residential, as kind of an evergreen, people will always have to live somewhere, right? And then with office, what we see currently is like a really big debate is like which kind of office is going to survive. Like, is going to be the CBD office going to be more important in the future, the big towers, for example, or and what happens to offices in B location? What happens to logistic properties? How is it going to work with the economy and so on? It's a bit more complex,
Right.
I guess, than residential.
Got it. Excellent. Well, I have run out of my questions. And Frederik, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of knowledge. Even though this is early days, but the sheer amount of research that you put in while building your startup makes you a domain expert, isn't it? Obviously, as you grow, as you mature, you will learn more. But since you mentioned about the mom test, since you mentioned about talking to at least 100 people, or maybe more, you it just makes you an authority on to speak about this subject. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with us.
Pleasure.
And all the best for your future. I'll be very, very curious and keenly rooting for you, and do all my bit to ensure that we spread the word out for Acquirepad.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I just had a look and I talked to 180 different people on basically design feedback and onboarding, problem discovery, and so on. So
Yeah, and
it's
just and also, you could, I mean, all these people that you talk to, they're not gone, right? So even if they did not convert into customers, you have a network of 280 investors, isn't it? So
yeah,
that itself is a great accomplishment. So
yeah, true.
kudos for that. All right, Frederick, thank you so much. See you around.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye. See you.